All right, we'll go ahead and get started here. Welcome to IASG. Yeah, so we got a bunch of stuff going on today. I'm going to start with the hack-a-box solution for last week. If you weren't here, basically we, as kind of like a beginner's night / after event, we came together and we're working on hacking a box from Vulnhub. And so I'm just going to go through the solution for that really quickly now for those that were curious. So if you don't want to know, I guess just try not to listen. Okay, so the first thing in any of these boxes, you need to discover where it is and what's open and what's running on it. So here I'm doing an mmap scan on the SICK-OS 5 host because that's the one I picked to work with. You can see I'm using -A to do service detection, OS detection, and then a port scan on that box. And then the -P just specifies all ports, 65,535 of them. Typically, if you don't specify that and only do, I think, the 1,000 most common ports, in these boxes I found that some of them have services running on really weird non-common ports, so it's good to do an all-port scan if you have the time, especially if you're only focused on one box like we are here. So as you can see, what we got back, so it's got SSH open. Another interesting thing, which we'll be looking at, is the Squid HTTP proxy running on 3128. And that's really all of interest here. We can tell that it's a Linux box because mmap was able to kind of determine that by probing the box through its service detection and then the port scanning that it did. So we know it's a Linux box and it's got SSH and then some sort of a HTTP proxy. So Squid Proxy is what's running on it, or at least what mmap says is running on it. In case you don't know, it's an HTTP web proxy, and that kind of hints to us that there may be a web server running on this box. And so what I tried doing, and what I guess is kind of the right way to go about this, is try to access HTTP data through the proxy. So there are a couple ways to do this. You can set it system-wide in Debian or Kali, which is basically Debian, but you can set the system-wide environment variables for HTTP proxy, or you can set them per tool. So a lot of tools that we'll be using to continue on with this box allow you to specify a proxy that way. So typically it's easier to just do it system-wide, but there you have options there. So okay, so what we do here in the first scan is I set the HTTP proxy. So we saw that it was port 3128 for the Squid, and so SICK-OS is the domain name of this box, and we're going through HTTP. So we set that, and then we basically run a curl command on that, which is now heading through the proxy and pulling from this box. And you can see that this is valid HTML here, so we are actually getting HTML back now, which if we had tried this command before we were going through the proxy, we would not have gotten anything. So now we know that there's got to be some sort of web server that's serving up this HTML. And my suggestion would be, one of my favorite tools is Nico, which is a open source web server scanner. So Nico will run through a web server, and it's going to look for vulnerabilities, things of interest. It'll do a little bit of file enumeration. And so, which you can see after running through this, and this is actually cut off, there's even more output. So there's kind of a lot to go through on a web server with Nico, depending on how much is wrong with it or misconfigured. But one of the things that should pop out if you look through this or have the time to do so is this part here. So the site appears vulnerable to the Shellshock vulnerability. And it looks like the path is CGI bin/status. And so this is kind of a red flag here. In case you don't know, I mean, I could literally do an entire talk on this, but the Shellshock vulnerability is essentially a bug in Bash, which allows you to do remote code execution. And long story short, because there is a lot that's involved with it, but you can basically, so you store functions in environment variables, just like we did, the environment variable we use for HTTP proxy. you can basically, with Apache, store functions inside of that. And what the bug was at the time, the vulnerability, was that there was really nothing stopping you from adding commands after that function definition. So this next picture I have highlights that pretty well. It's from OWASP. But essentially here we're setting the environment variable, and here's our function. So this is a valid function definition, one of the shortest ones you can do, just to demonstrate that. But after, now we have our remote code execution. So all of this is getting executed as a valid command as it's being stored in the environmental variable. So as you can see, we're echoing test here, but the opportunities are pretty much endless for what you want to run. So how does this affect us? The server that SickOS has is running Apache, and thanks to CGI, the user agent, which is sent in the header for HTTP requests, is stored as an environment variable. So something that we are sending the server gets stored on the server, and in the form of an environmental variable, which allows us to take advantage of this remote code execution. So if we can construct and send an HTTP request to the server, we can basically remotely run a command in bash. And so the first thing that I tried, and you can really do a lot of things to indicate that this works, is you can tell the server to ping us, so ping me, so I can set up like a netcat listener and say, hey, ping me, and if I get a ping back from the server, I know I made the server do that. Okay, so verifying that this does work, I'm kind of going through this quickly, but essentially in this red window, this is a separate terminal I have set up, which you can do with tmux, which is on the Kali boxes. I have a netcat listener set up on port 12345, which is just a random port. -LVP, -L is listen for incoming connections, P is port, and V is verbose, so we get the output here. And then here is the actual command that I'm running. So we're doing a curl command. We are essentially connecting through the proxy to the actual box. And we're setting the user agent header by specifying -H. And this is a command we're running. So after our function definition, which is pretty much just blank, we're saying ping us, that is the IP, at port 12345. That's what we're listening on. After you run it, we get a response back from the web server. So the web server pinged us. We know this remote code execution vulnerability worked. Okay, so to get low-level access on the box, we can use a reverse shell. A very simple one is devtcp. If you do a search for Pentest Monkey, they've got a few different, basically reverse shells that you can work with. But this one by default is already on the box, so you basically just redirect interactive output from bin/bash over the wire and then to your netcat listener. So same thing as before, we're setting up a netcat listener, running a command to get a reverse shell to that port, and that's how we get our initial access. So we can pop the shell, run whoami, and we're actually www.data, which is a user that Apache uses by default to do some web server operations. So at that point, we're on the box as a low-level user. We can start looking around. And just to speed things up here, after I looked around, I was able to find a little hint on the box that mentioned this connect.py script. And something about it running quite frequently, and so that gave me the basically the hint to go ahead and look at the cron jobs. And within the cron jobs, I saw that the connect.py was being run as root every so often. And so if you look at the permissions for the connect.py file, you can see that anyone could edit it. So this is another reverse shell from Pentest Monkey. It's a Python reverse shell, runs on Python 2.7, which was on the box, and you can determine that in a various number of ways. But essentially, you copy and paste that into the file, save the file. You're going to set it up so that you would change this IP address, this port, to your netcat box and the netcat listening port. And then you just wait. And the cron job runs that as root. And so what you get, essentially, well, I guess I don't have another slide, but essentially what you get is a reverse shell running as the root user, because the root executed that Python script, which has a reverse shell, and now you're root. So that's actually not the only way to root. I'm not going to go into the other ways, but that's another awesome thing about these boxes is there are multiple ways that you can basically win at this mini CTF, if you will. So one thing that I like to do is after I finish one of these boxes is go on VulnHub. They've got a walkthroughs tab. You can click on it and there's like 20 or so, depending on the box, different walkthroughs that people have done. And it's good to just read through all those and figure out things that you maybe didn't think of or didn't even try. Another big thing with these boxes, don't become discouraged. If you do get stuck for a few days, it's totally cool to just look at the walkthroughs to get ideas. This is a learning process. So don't become discouraged if you are completely stuck. Use the walkthroughs if you need to. You'll gain that experience and things will maybe get easier as you continue. And then there is a SicOS version 1.2, so feel free to try that one. That one is just as good as 1.1. It is different though, so it's a different beast. But yeah, and that is the solution for the first Hackerbox. We'll be doing a couple more of these throughout the semester, but they obviously will be different. So yeah, until then. Okay, so now I'm gonna hand it off to Kole, who's gonna talk about another CTF type event we might do, and then the puzzler.
So Texas A&M is going to be starting a CTF that starts on, I think, Friday or Saturday, which is intended for high school and college students. So we're going to create a team to try at it and work together on either Saturday or Sunday. If you're interested in joining, which would be great if you haven't done a CTF before, since it's intended for high school and college students, you can fill out a survey that I put in our Slack channel, post it in general, post it again, and figure out what time everybody can meet together. There'll be free food as well. And the second announcement I have is first weekly puzzler was posted last week. I don't know if I actually mentioned it or not, but you can find it on our website. Just go to puzzlers, and it was this one, 206, and then so that one I saw or posted last week. This one is the one for this week, 213, and I'll just run through the one from the solution to last week's puzzler, which I think a couple people were able to solve. So this one was a steganography challenge, which you started off with just a regular image, and if you looked at it through a hex dump, you could see that somewhere around, so I can figure out where it is exactly at. I think it's around here somewhere. I'll just grab for it, I guess. Okay, so if you look at the hex dump, you'll see that there is actually an end of file chunk towards the middle of the file, which is followed by another PNG header file or chunk, which shows that there's actually 2 images in this file. But if you look at through most programs, will just show you the first one. But if you either manually extract the second one just from the hex dump or use a program called Foremost, it will actually extract hidden files inside of a file, which will be shown in this folder called output. And if you go to that folder, it will create another folder which has both images inside of it. And if you just see, so here's the first one again, and then the second file is XCG opens images from command line. And then here's the second file. Questions about this one? All right, I'll hand it over to Kevin then.
All right, I'm going to be doing a talk about mobile security, kind of an introduction to mobile security, if my laptop turns on. Hold on, it'll go in a second. Maybe. Okay. All right, so yeah, I'm gonna be talking about mobile security for a bit, kind of an introduction, and talk about different ways. Oh gosh. We're going to start off by talking about, actually, hold on, let me do something real quick. Okay, now it's ready, I think. Yeah, so we're going to start off by talking about why mobile security is important for people to care about and be conscious about. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what happens and what can happen, both mainly in the past, like different vulnerabilities that have happened already, and why they were bad. And then we're going to talk about kind of the future and where things are going and how to stay safe regarding mobile security. All right, so to start off, mobile devices. Why is it not full screen? Okay, the bar's just going to be at the bottom, sorry. So mobile devices are important because there's so many of them nowadays. There's always an increasing number as they become more and more popular. So currently there's about 5 billion users in the world that have mobile devices. And the mobile subscriptions, like how many devices are or have a card in them, is actually greater than the population. It's a little bit over 100%, meaning that the number of people that have 2 devices puts it over the actual population. And this equates to like 66% of the population actually having a mobile device in the world. And like I said, there's a little bit over 100%, which equates to about 8 billion mobile connections in the world. And a lot of these devices keep personal data. Like most people here would probably just have pictures and apps and things on their phone that aren't too important, but a lot of people also keep sensitive information. Like if they work for a company, they'll have their emails on there or access to get onto a server that has sensitive information that you don't want getting out, which is why it's important to keep this stuff secure. And also just general privacy. You don't want all your information on your phone to be out that somebody can get. It's also important for mobile security because devices are so small, it can be easy to lose them or if there's something to happen to them. And it's also easier to not catch something that's happening if you go to a browser. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Mobile devices also, as many of you know, can connect to Wi-Fi and have a cellular connection, which is important because when you go somewhere with your phone, you're more likely to connect to just a random Wi-Fi thing if you're there like a coffee shop or really anywhere you're at. And a lot of those can be insecure, so it's something to think about. And they're also becoming increasingly powerful, which means that different attacks can be used on mobile devices as they become more powerful. And it can be more realistic for attackers. So kind of repeating some of that, the main difference between like a normal desktop computer or even a laptop to mobile devices, a lot of times mobile devices won't be kept up to date. A lot of our phones will keep up to date and do system updates, but if you have an older one, you're not as likely to go back and make sure it's updated and protected if there is a vulnerability. Obviously the size, since they're mobile, it's easier to take around to different places, which can expose them to different networks, which could possibly be unsafe. The way that people use their phones also differ, because if you got on a mobile device and you're checking your emails from a random place, you're most likely not on a secure network, or you're on cellular connection, which is usually fine. But usually the places you use them is the main problem with mobile devices. Could be a problem. People also don't typically have a strong antivirus on their phone. It's not something they really think about. Compared to a computer, which more likely you'll download something that'll be useful at keeping it safe, but on phones, typically people don't worry about that as much. Also, the way that people use apps on their phones is different than a normal computer, which you could have different apps on a laptop or say something like that, like the Windows Store. But on your phones, there's such a large number of apps that typically these can be exposed to a vulnerability just because the way to get onto like the App Store can be sometimes easy and something can go over like the check to make sure that it's safe. So being able to recognize if an app isn't really as secure as you think it is also important. So one of the main problems with mobile devices is actually theft and loss, which kind of makes sense. A lot of us probably leave our phone sitting somewhere and forget where it is. And if this happens, whatever data is on there could possibly be accessed by whoever picks it up, which could be a problem, obviously. This fact is a bit outdated. I think it was from 3 or 4 years ago, but they found that every 113 mobile devices or phones or a tablet are found from being left somewhere stolen every minute in the US. And also there's another fact, I don't know how good of a fact it is, it's from 2011, Lookout Security found that, or they say that they found $2.5 billion worth of phones through their app, but I mean, they're like also advertising their own app, so I don't know if that's the greatest stat to base it off of. The main problem with this, so Semantic Test did a test where they placed 50 phones just out in public to see what would happen if people would pick them up. So of the 50, they found that 96% of them were accessed by somebody. Somebody picked them up and looked at it and maybe tried to do something on it. And 80% tried to access data, so tried to like sign into the phone or get the password to go in, and then they could possibly figure out like whose phone it is or other information that's kept on there, which is why it's important to make sure that if you do lose your phone, somehow it's also secured with a password or some way that if they get your phone, they can't really do much with it. We're also going to talk about malware on mobile devices. So this is becoming more popular as well. As they become more popular in the world, attackers will want to be able to get the information, which is constantly being increased on the devices. So according to McAfee Labs, there's about 16 million mobile malware incidents, and that's kind of increasing as they become more popular, as I just said. So it's something that you can kind of realize that people are trying to actually put malware onto phones and to steal information or get information about it or use it for any other type of, or any way to gain themselves, which we'll talk a little bit more too. Typically iOS has much less malware on them just because of the way that an app can get onto the App Store. It's a bit more difficult than Android. It can be easier for someone to just make an app, even if it has a vulnerability in there or malware. Sometimes it can not be caught. So if there's an app that nobody else has really downloaded and it's from a developer that no one's really heard of, worrying that it might not be a great app is something to think about. The main categories of malware on mobile devices are Trojans, which means that it goes onto your phone in a way that you don't think it's malicious, but in the end it's actually doing something there. Spyware, which means it's sitting on your phone and you don't realize it's there and it's actually stealing data or looking at information on your phone and you're not aware of that happening. Adware, which is installing ads or somehow going to ads and clicking them so that the attacker is making money from them, which we'll talk about later. There's a couple examples that use that. And also botnets, which, as I mentioned, they're becoming more powerful. It's becoming a little bit more realistic to use them as a botnet on mobile devices, and they can actually do some things that are pretty bad for most people. And also, I think there's one example from last week that we'll get into that was like a cryptocurrency mining through mobile devices. So these are a few examples of mobile malware. I'm not going to go through all of them, but for example, Pegasus, which is this one here, the description is it masquerades as an app to gain root access and harvest data or do surveillance. This is an example of spyware, and this was bad because it was on iOS and Android. I think it was last year, it says, a year and a half ago almost now, in August. And this one was pretty popular because it got onto a lot of devices and they weren't able to tell it was there because it's spyware, as I mentioned, and they were able to get a lot of information from users. Another one I'm going to mention and talk about more in the next couple slides is Viking Horde, which is a botnet. And this one is significant because it was one of the first main botnets on mobile devices. We're going to talk about the specifics later, so we'll get to that. And all these other ones, you can see most of them are Android in general. There's a few iOS ones, and these are from, I think this actual picture is from late 2016, I believe. So it doesn't have all the newest ones that have come out, but this is kind of a lot of the popular ones. So one of the problems with losing data is location. And a big thing with mobile security and mobile devices in general is convenience versus privacy. So it can be convenient to have your location always on, because I'm sure a lot of us do, I always do. But the problem with that is if there's an app that's leaking data, it can be a problem because they can get your location, which you obviously wouldn't really want random people to know. But there is the convenience factor of having it on if you're trying to get navigation through Google Maps or anything like that, or really any app that uses location. Typically a lot of people just leave it on. Permissions are also in the location, so an app will ask if it has permission to use your location. So making sure that it's an app that you actually trust and want to have access to your location is important. And the problem, as I mentioned, is data leaks with location. If someone is able or has access to your location and they're taking that information and somehow sending it somewhere else, that can be a problem. So one of the easiest ways to make sure that your phone is not at risk of, if you lose it, for someone to get your data, is to have some kind of password on there or media access control, a way for someone to get into your phone if they physically have it, because that's usually the easiest way to get into a phone is if you're holding it in your hand. So the ways that people use authentication on their phone is in a variety of ways, which there's a diagram on the next slide. Authentication is usually described as either something you know, something you are, or something you have. Usually on your phone, you're going to do something you know, like a password or a pattern, like you can see on that one, which typically is a little bit less secure. For example, like a pattern, if someone looks at your phone, they could see the outline of where your phone always unlocks it, like the oil from your fingers. So that's something that you could notice. Or a lot of people's passwords are something really simple just because it's more convenient for them. They don't want to have to type a huge password in every time they go on their phone, which a lot of people do pretty frequently. So that's the whole convenience versus privacy and security again. So here's a couple more. Passwords and the pattern lock are ones would be something that you know, and those are probably the most popular on phones. A lot of new ones have a fingerprint scanner, which would be under the biometrics, which is something that you are. And those are a lot more secure just because it's your actual fingerprint. But the implementation of those is a bit more, and the technology you need is harder. So yeah, some of those can be a bit more hard to put in devices, especially an older device that doesn't have it isn't going to be able to obviously take advantage of that. And smart cards really aren't very practical for a mobile device just because people don't carry around something like that. And they always have their phone with them too, so that's not really feasible for mobile devices. Right, as we talked a little bit ago about the different types of malware and things on mobile devices, botnets are one that are becoming a bit more prevalent because of the power of mobile devices. So also, yeah, the number of devices available also is why this is increasing. If there's a lot out there, it's obviously easier to make a bigger botnet. So this is an example of one that happened just last week. It was a mining botnet, and it worked kind of like a worm, where once it would get into one device, that device would try and find other devices to infect with it. It would look through the internet port 5555, which is opened a few ways, but one of them is through Android Debug Bridge. So if a device had that and it opened the port and then another device found it, they could use that as a way to get into the next device. And they found that through this botnet, which wasn't terribly large at all, they got about 5,000 devices in 24 hours. And since devices still aren't extremely powerful compared to like an actual computer, I think they esse that it made the attacker like $3 in that 24 hours. So it wasn't a great successful operation for them, but it's kind of showing how the future could change. And sometimes if this gets to a huge botnet, it could be a pretty good like idea for an attacker if they want to make money this way. So that's something that could continue to increase in the future. Some more examples of botnets. As I mentioned, Viking Horde is the first one, and that one works as kind of a DDoS attack. And once the infected devices were on there, it could send a lot of, I think it was HTTP GET requests to other ones, and they said it was about 20,000 requests per second, which isn't a terribly large amount, but depending on what it's going at, they could be significant, and depending on the number of devices that are going after a single target. This was from May 2016, so like I said, it's one of the earlier ones. It was also used for ad fraud, so they could make money using ads that were from a different device. And the way that it got onto most phones was through an app called Viking Jump, which in some places was a pretty popular app, but they didn't realize that it actually had this malicious background in there and what it was really being used for. And it could also be used for a couple other attacks, but that was the main one it would do. Another attack is Hummingbad, which was pretty large. I think at its peak it had about 10 million devices that it infected. And that one was from February of 2016. And that kind of established a rootkit on there that was pretty persistent and hard to get rid of. And it would also mainly use fraudulent ad revenue. And it could also install different fraudulent ads on your device as well, because it had root access. This one was kind of described as a larger, like an operation, an actual company that had employees, so it was a pretty big thing. And they estimated that it was making about $300,000 a month at its peak through the ad fraud. So it shows kind of how a lot of these can make the attacker a lot of money, and makes sense for them to want to do this if they're trying to. Another botnet is WireX, which had about 120,000 IPs at its peak. And this one is from August of 2017, so it's a bit more recent. Actually, this one also was a DDoS attack, and this is the one that would use the HTTP GET request and had about 20,000 per second at its peak, not the first one. Sorry about that. And they could also use this one for ransomware sometimes. If they were going after a server, they could demand some money so that they would stop. And this was also in 100 countries, so it kind of spread across the globe. The last botnet that we're going to talk about is Dress Code, which was from August 2016, so it was about a year before the last one. And when it first came out, Google said it was on, I think it was 400 devices approximately. And they said once they took those off the App Store or the Play Store, that the botnet was gone and that it wasn't worth really caring about because it was done. But they think that it was actually on more like 3,000 apps, which means that it wasn't gone. So there's kind of a second wave. The first one had up to 4 million devices at one time, and it would use the SOX protocol to steal sensitive data from the phones and the various ones that it was on. And the new one, they think, is about 2.6 million downloads, and it was used mainly for fraudulent advertisement as well to make money for the attacker. That's kind of an example of how the Viking horde would work depending on if it had root access or not, and it would make a connection back to the, or would use a proxy connection to go back to the actual attacker so that they could do whatever they wanted at the given time. Wi-Fi interference, as I mentioned, if you go somewhere to say a coffee shop, there's a chance that the Wi-Fi isn't as secure and you're more susceptible to a man-in-the-middle attack. So being on a mobile device, it's important to think about this, because on a desktop, you're usually not going to a different network that you're not comfortable with or not familiar with. So just being aware of that is something that's important. People also tend to try to do social engineering for mobile users as well, which can be a bit easier because when you're on your phone, you're usually doing things that aren't as important, just going on like social media or looking through really anything, and it's not as, you're not really thinking about it as much. So it's possible that you'll click an ad or something that takes you to a page that you don't realize what it is, or it's actually doing something you don't want, but you're not aware of it. And that's, social engineering is mainly used to fool the user into doing something that they don't realize is actually happening. So a lot of times on a phone, this will be through an ad or an app that says it'll make your phone secure. I'm sure we've seen things like that. And yeah, that's why it's more prevalent on mobile devices, or it can be more prevalent on mobile devices. So one of the big problems I mentioned is more sensitive data is on phones, and it's become more popular for people to have their work information or other important information is data leaks, which if an app or something is leaking data, it could be a problem and it could access the data that you don't want to leave, obviously. So a study showed that 0.3% of 20 million Android apps, I believe, or Android devices that they studied had some type of data leak in there, and 0.5% of 26 on iOS. And a lot of these could be kind of benign and not really important. They're just information that doesn't mean a whole lot. It could be metadata, which means something like the information about the phone, various things like that, which isn't a huge deal if you lose, but some of this, if you have important things on your phone, could be lost, which is a bit more severe. And location, as I mentioned earlier, is the thing that's kind of often lost. So we talked about this in the fall, the crack attacks, which we talked about briefly in the presentation, so we're not going to get into too many details about it, but Android devices were affected kind of a lot because it goes to different networks more frequently, and this means that something could be listening to the handshake that's happening when the device first looks for the network, and if it knows that and knows information about it, it could be used to fake data and forge various data and interfere with whatever you're actually trying to do without you knowing, and inject kind of any kind of malicious code or taking you to a website that has things that are not what you think in it, which means that this could be pretty bad. Another example of an attack is permission redelegation, which if you look at this is kind of when you download it, it's going to ask if it has permission to use Wi-Fi. And usually an app that's fine is going to have this. So there's a Wi-Fi control up at the top, which has access to Wi-Fi, which is fine. And then there's an attacker app that doesn't get permission, which means it shouldn't be able to use Wi-Fi or to do anything like that, which is a good thing. But the problem is, through this attack, they kind of go through the other app, which if the other app isn't very secure and doesn't check, it could expose or kind of be a front for the attacker's app to go in and get access to the Wi-Fi or whatever it's trying to get into. And this often isn't as strict as going through the actual, like it says on the left, the Wi-Fi manager in this case. So it's much more possible that the other app is going to allow the attacker's app to have permission to do things that are potentially harmful to your device. So there was well, as I just said, a lot of apps are exposed public interfaces, which is why the other apps can go in and possibly get permissions you wouldn't expect. And there's a study that had about 872 apps in it, and they found that of those, about 320 had at least one type of public component where another app could possibly look in and get access to something it shouldn't have access to. And they were able to construct attacks using 15 of these vulnerabilities in about 5 of the apps. So it's not a huge amount, but it's still something that you should worry about if you have an app that isn't as secure as you might think. It could possibly lead to something like this. Another one is the bridge to JavaScript for the web view in Android. And the problem with this is that they can inject JavaScript into a web view, which means that it could be doing certain things that you don't really want it to, it shouldn't be able to. And this is abusing, as I just said, the web view and JavaScript bridge between them, and uses reflection to acquire a reference to a runtime object, which gives it the information on the actual device to go in and inject whatever they're trying to put into it. So the main vulnerabilities related to this are loading untrusted content, URLs leaked to other apps because it has a reference to that object, and also exposed state changing navigation to foreign apps, which is kind of similar to the last one and how it works. Some other quick ones. One of the possible vulnerabilities is how an app handles an unreceived SSL error. A lot of apps just ignore it, which could be a problem. They actually changed how it goes through how an app has to deal with it, but the previous way would mean that it could possibly, if it's ignored, it would lead to a person being able to go in and kind of just, even though there was an error, it would kind of ignore that and not do anything about it, which could potentially be a problem. And then a lot of other vulnerabilities are just related to going to a website or loading a website which you don't see, because when you're on your phone, you really don't look at the URL. Even if you don't on your desktop, you're even less likely. On a phone, just because it's a bit smaller, it's hard to see, or you don't really look or care where you're actually at. And that's just some stats about it, but it's not terribly important. Another attack is Fragment Injection. Kind of just relating to this is mainly for outdated devices, as pretty much all these are, because if they're known like they are and we're talking about them, it means that obviously they've been figured out and they know why it works, so there's been some kind of update to solve it. And if there is an update to solve it, it's pretty much fine. You don't have to worry about it too much. But if your device is outdated, like we said at the beginning, phones can often be outdated. They could still be vulnerable to these, so that's why it's important to update your phone. This attack specifically, though, is mainly related to the preference activity class. And there's an example here that I'll get into, which kind of makes a bit more sense. But they use it to inject a fragment into another class that they typically wouldn't be able to. So the first kind of proof of how this works was with a sign-in on an app, or like entering credentials to get into it. There was a settings class that was exported through an app, and after that, it means it's visible kind of, and the attacker was able to inject another class with a fragment to get into that and send something that, for example, this one was setting confirm credentials extra to false, which means that it's not even checking if it's actually signing in, it's just going to let you in the app. So obviously you wouldn't want it to be able to send something in that's able to ignore something like signing in, because that's not how the app is intended to be used. And this can also be used for stuff like SQL injection or JavaScript, and it's mainly done on the client side, just because of how you're actually working with the app. So these are a couple, there's a couple coming up about how studies have shown what's actually happening in apps and figuring out the problems, which is the first step in obviously solving them. We need to know what's actually happening on the devices. So this was originally done by Intel, Penn State, and Duke, and they would run these tests on the various phones and monitor what's happening and where the information's going, just to see where it's going and if there's a data leak or anything like that that's happening. So in this first one, they ran about 30 tests around different apps, and they found that about 15 of them were somehow leaking location through some app or some way on the device, and 7 of the 30 that they tested were leaking unique identifiers and other important info, which is kind of a larger problem typically if it's something that's important information or something you don't want getting out and it's being leaked. That's not good. This is kind of a similar thing, D2 taint, and this is an IFT, which is like the information flow tracking, which is, like I said, just kind of figuring out what's actually happening on the device. And through the apps that they studied, they found that about 80% of the apps actually leak data in some way, and 14 leak sensitive data, which is obviously more severe because it's sensitive. So once they were able to find these problems, they were able to kind of figure out why it's happening, not just what's happening, and come up with solutions for that. So studies like this are kind of important to the advancement of cybersecurity related to mobile devices. So what's to come in the future and how to kind of stay safe from these things? A lot of companies believe that attacks are increasing just because they see it more within their company. A lot of times companies will hand out mobile devices, and if those are used unwisely or not really safely, or they don't think about security, that could be a problem. So this was a study by Dimensional Research, as it says at the bottom, and they went out and asked a bunch of companies various questions about their devices and how they're handled at their company. And they found that about 20% of the companies' mobile devices were breached, or they believed them to be breached at some point, meaning that they lost information or something on there was vulnerable and it was exploited. And 24% were unsure, which could also be a problem if you don't know what's happening with your devices. You could be losing data, or something could be maliciously on them, and if you don't know it, that's obviously not good because you can't solve it if you don't know it's there. 94% of these companies also expect the frequency to increase just based on how it's been increasing in the past. They don't really see a reason for it to stop, so that's why they say that. And 79% say it's becoming more difficult to actually detect and stop these attacks. So it shows that in the future they need to put more resources into actually making sure that devices within their company are safe. Some other upcoming threats, we talked about most of these already, and it's just kind of saying that these are the ones that are continue to be pretty prevalent in mobile security: data leaks, social engineering, Wi-Fi interference, out-of-date devices, and physical device breaches, which is like losing your phone, as we talked about in the beginning. These are kind of the main 5 that we talked about, and those are the ones that continue to be the most popular and common ones that we'll see. So the way to protect from these actual attacks or different vulnerabilities that are going to be happening, obviously the first step is detecting them. That's the main way to stop something, is once you know it. You have to know what's happening in order to stop it. So there are apps that you can get. One of them, for example, is Mobile Scope. It's been out for a little bit. There's other ones as well, and those can make sure that your phone is secure and works similar to how an antivirus would, or something of that nature on a different computer, but it's for phones. And also just being smart with apps and making sure that it's from like a developer that's trusted and takes care of making sure that when they write the app, it's actually secure and they're not missing any main vulnerability, which should be caught, but there's a chance, as we said, on, for example, like the Play Store, that there's an app that's on there that has some kind of vulnerability or malicious part of it, and it didn't get caught, so it's on there. So you just want to make sure that you're being safe and checking to make sure that you don't download those kinds of apps. So the best practices for this are having some kind of security software, also keeping your devices up to date to make sure that if there is some kind of vulnerability, it gets patched through an update and that you don't have to worry about it anymore. Also something like a phone finder. So if you lose your phone, you can find it and you're not gonna have somebody pick it up and try and get access, or actually get access to whatever's on there. And also having backups in case you do lose your phone or something like that and you have sensitive data that you really can't afford to lose, that you don't actually lose it, just because of how common it is for people to misplace their phones or lose them. And that also kind of goes with any kind of security. You want to have backups. As I said, understand the apps you have installed is important in making sure that you're not having apps that are kind of weird or ones that you shouldn't have on your thing. Don't lose your device, goes with that. Use your apps in a smart way and make sure that there's not some kind of website you're going to that's not safe, or some kind of ad that you don't want to be clicking. And also getting rid of dead apps, which are apps that are no longer like supported by the actual developer. And so that's why they call it dead, because it's not being updated. So just because it's up to date doesn't mean that it's safe. If it's not being supported anymore, there's a chance that it hasn't been updated in, say, a few years, and there's vulnerabilities that have not been fixed inside that app. So it's important to not have those apps on your phone. When you go and use public Wi-Fi, it's also important to make sure that you actually trust it or you're being safe with what you're doing on the network. Checking URLs on a mobile device is also important, but sometimes a bit harder to do and less common for people to do. So you might have noticed that a lot of these are kind of universal for security in general, and it's important to kind of focus on them on your mobile device as well, because it's likely that you could also be exposed to similar vulnerabilities as a normal like desktop Windows computer, or really whatever you're on. So are there any questions about anything? Just kind of went through all that. Did anything not make sense, or you want to explain more, hear it again? Okay. So if you want to learn more about this stuff, the best way is probably to just look up a specific topic and to try and learn about it. That's mainly how I just read about things like this, and just go on there, and there's a lot of websites and videos that'll help you out. And this presentation will also be on the past presentations Google Drive folder for IASG. So you may have noticed there were some links at the bottom of some of the slides for references that I used. You can also check those out and read whatever article is in there. And that's about it though.